I've never had an intro like that before. I live a little bit less of a exciting life. So hi, I'm Steve Hoffman from McKinsey, partner in our Chicago office. First of all, just thanks so much for having me. So I lead our retail procurement and sustainability practice. And I've spent a lot of time with retail clients, wholesalers, a lot of your clients, talking about e-commerce. And what we've seen in kind of the pandemic was obviously the growth of e-commerce, and that being sort of a revenue lifeline. And we wrote an article about it if you haven't read it. But it really turned into a bit of a question around a paradox, because while it was a really important time to capture the consumer and to capture e-commerce sales, it also created a lot of uncertainty with how to manage the costs and how to manage the life cycle costs or life cycle value. And so through the article, we did a lot of research to understand what actually is happening, because as we started to engage with our clients, we saw that with this explosion of growth and this kind of what a lot of people would say is 10 years of e-commerce growth happened in 3 months, 5 months, there just wasn't really a lot of rigor that when it came to thinking through what the decisions we were making, how does it affect individual transactions, how does it affect individual customers, and so this is a lot of what we kind of looked into. And I think, as you can all imagine, as e-commerce growth is there, the total cost of fulfillment is also kind of on the rise, especially with the latest inflation and things like that. And so what I'd like to talk about is what are the ways in which you can think about driving long-term value, because it's a lot more than just cost or revenue, long-term value when it comes to e-commerce. And I think what are the learnings that we've seen certain players use, and how can you all think about it differently? So, the Catch-22. So many estimates would say that by 2024, e-commerce will probably be about 50% of total retail sales. So I think right now I would say it's a bit of a yellow light turning to a red light in terms of how do you actually manage the long-term value of this. And as we looked into some of the research, and hopefully everyone can see this I think is a pretty critical way to look at it. So over the last 5 years, we looked at the performance of 100 retailers, and we looked at total shareholder return. And so we grouped them based on quartiles. So there's 25 retailers in the top quartile, 25 in second, third, and fourth. So broken out by total shareholder return. The thing that really jumps out is the third column. As you had more e-commerce growth, so the bottom two quartiles, you tended to end up in the bottom quartiles. So you can see the top quartile only had 8% e-commerce growth, but the bottom two quartiles had an average of 17%. So what does that say? So it could imply, with the more e-commerce growth that you are kind of relying on, the lower shareholder return you have. But what it also shows is really an opportunity, because for the folks that are at the top quartile, so once again, this is top quartile, total shareholder return. So if you're not familiar with that term, essentially it is, what is the rate of return I'm getting if I'm investing as you into a company? So if I invest $1 in, what is the rate of return I'm getting? So a top quartile is gonna get a lot higher return than a bottom quartile. So what can we learn from the companies that are in the top quartile that are getting a lot more value for their e-commerce growth, right? So total shareholder return than the bottom quartile. What can we also learn from the bottom quartile around their over-reliance on e-commerce growth? Because you can see their total revenue growth was actually minus 1%. But so they're shifting a lot of their brick and mortar sales to e-commerce, but they're actually losing money, they're losing total growth, and they're destroying value for their shareholders. So this was the kind of crux of all of the research. And so we use this as a bit of a jumping off point to understand what's actually happening. What is separating the top quartile from the bottom quartile? And what can all of us do when you think about total managing commerce? So before I get into some of the ideas or some of the ways in which you can think about it, there are some inherent advantages when it comes to e-commerce. So if you work with a client, or if you're at a wholesaler or a brand or a retailer that has a higher average basket size or higher item value, so you're selling luxury handbags, you're gonna have a natural advantage, right? Because at the end of the day, if I put a $5,000 handbag in a box versus a $10 pair of jeans in a box, the box kind of costs pretty much the same cost to get it to me. Even, yeah, I might overnight it because it's a handbag, but at the end of the day, it's somewhere between $5, $10, $15, $25. So there is an inherent advantage with item value or basket value. The second thing is having unique or custom products. So it's a lot easier for customers to price shop something that is a branded good. So branded blender, branded jeans. I mean, if you are a retailer or you're a wholesaler that really provides just overall branded goods versus you have a very large amount of your own brand items or services, add-ons that you have, that can just really affect I would say, your advantage when it comes to managing e-commerce. And third is that there's a lot of categories that just have very different return rates. So top of the list will be dresses, jeans tend to have 30, 40% return rate. Bottom, furniture, a lot of personal care items have much lower return rate. So when you think about the total cost of managing e-commerce, return rate's a very important factor. So just before you get into like what are the ways in which you think about it, there are some inherent advantages that based on where you're starting from that you can think about taking advantage of also when you think about building the overall e-commerce approach. So we would say there's 4 imperatives when you think about managing profitability. So this is about profitability, not sales. This is about how do you manage a profitable e-commerce business, not just a high sales e-commerce. So first is, what is the North Star? So when we looked and we talked to a lot of our different clients, there's just competing objectives. There's a lot of different folks in the organization that are driving towards different metrics. So the digital team or the commercial team may be driving towards a sales target, maybe driving for a conversion target, an engagement target, a loyalty target. Supply chain team may be driving towards a cost target, a service target. What is the one target that we're all gonna stack hands on? And how are we gonna think about that? One term that I'll use is PFL. So it means product fulfillment logic. So what a lot of companies use when you click to buy something, they try to send it to you at the lowest cost. So where's the closest location that item is stocked? What's the lowest cost to deliver it to you? And boom, that's the way it's gonna get to you. But it doesn't really take into account profit. What if I'm taking an item off the shelf in a store that's the last item? And there's the velocity metrics would say, well, someone's gonna buy that in the store probably in the next few days. That overall is a lower profit transaction by taking something off the shelf, even though it's a lower cost transaction to send it to me, it's a lower profit transaction because of the propensity for someone to buy that item in person the next couple days. So how do you move from this idea of cost to profit? And so you take into account more metrics, you think about a more of an end-to-end view of value and profit, not just cost, not just individual metrics. So we would say it's moving from a functional approach to moving it to a system approach. So along with this also is how do we get a handle on the transparency of costs? We've been doing e-commerce for over 20 years, but there's actually so much we're learning about where all the costs end up. So this brings us to the next point. So generating more value from your fixed costs, your fixed assets. What does that mean? That means, do I have a view of profitability at a SKU level or a transaction level? So we'll do a quick show of hands. So let's say I bought this suit for $100. Is it better for me to return it if I want to return it, is it better for me to return it to the store or to send it back to you if you're the retailer that sold this to me? Who thinks it is better for me to return it to the store? So few hands, return it to the store. Who thinks it's better to send it back? To like put it in a box, send it back to a return logistics center? And then everybody else is the third option, which is it depends, which is actually the right answer. And this is also one of the kind of, based on where most of the maturity and a lot of the alignment is, it depends. Because while this is $100, let's say it cost, I don't know, $10 to ship it to me, could cost $10 to ship it back, right? If I return it to the store, well, I might actually then buy something else in the store. However, A lot of items that are carried in the store, they're carried online, are not carried in the store, right? There's the idea of endless aisle. And so if I return this to a store that does not stock it, it'll be what's called discontinuous inventory, which is it will end up on some rack. It'll have a probably greater than 90% chance of getting marked down because no one will ever go to the store looking for this. And so this is some of the things that we've seen when it comes to managing e-commerce, right? There is a lack of like transaction level decision making. So the most ideal would be when I go to say I want to return it, there's an algorithm that says, where's Steve located? What is he returning? If he's going to return it to the store, which store is he going to send it to? Does that store carry it? And even if it does it have a lot of inventory? Because if I take something back to a store that already has 100 of those, probably also up as a markdown, if I send it back, where does it go back to? And so where is it in the total kind of markdown process? So there's a lot of different things that should come together that should say, and then maybe even some incentives, and we'll get to that in a second. What is the best value for the organization for that individual transaction? And the answer is, you're absolutely right for the folks who didn't raise their hand, whether you didn't want to answer, but it depends. Depends on the person, depends on the transaction, depends on the item, the time of year, where it is in the sales cycle. And so that's really what we're talking about when it comes to managing e-commerce, is around like really scraping for every individual piece of value you can get from your fixed costs, your fixed assets. So consumer experience. There are a lot of things that retailers, brands can do that actually are lower cost and perhaps even better experience. So one example would be the idea of BOPIS, buy online, pick up in store. I think it's a really underutilized approach, or really underutilized asset that most retailers have. Because right now it's pretty clunky. But it gets you into the store, it reduces the cost of kind of fulfillment and things like that. But it is somewhere around 10, 12% penetration right now, depending on the retailer, if they offer it. But it can actually improve the overall customer experience because you can get an item faster when you want it. Right now it's just clunky because you have to maybe get a time where you can pick it up, and maybe it's just not really on your terms. And so another example would be the idea of incentivizing me to use a debit card. Debit card is a much lower transaction cost than a credit card because of the card not present aspect of a credit card buying online because of the fraud. So there's a lot of ways at which individual pieces, individual small solutions can reduce the cost, can improve the consumer experience, and they can really help make sure that you're generating more value from e-commerce. I'll hit on the last one, I'll circle back to a couple more. So, organization. This is, I think, where a lot of things kind of break down. And I talked about it a bit in the aligning on the North Star, but when it comes to the organization, most people are just too slow. They're too slow to react. We focus too much time on what is the answer, what is the solution, versus what can work today and actually start heading towards a path towards value, and how do I actually create an agile organization that can continually adapt based on what's happening, based on what my competitors do, based on how the consumer's responding, based on what's happening with inflation, based on a variety of things. And this, I think, is one of the things that really, I think, changes the way in which the rest of the whole thing works. Because when you start to identify whether it's a problem or an opportunity, the speed at which an organization can come together in a scrum team or in whatever way you can organize yourself to go after an objective is really going to be the difference, I think, between folks who will make it through the next 5 years through this kind of e-commerce kind of yellow light moving to a red light, and those who won't, because it really will come down to speed and adaptation and agility. So a couple more anecdotes. The idea of returns, I think, is a really appreciated complexity when it comes to retail. And I think this hits out almost all of these. I haven't personally worked with a client who actually has someone who actually owns returns end to end. There's folks in supply chain that own the return center. There's folks who own the returns experience, perhaps the front end of it, perhaps the web experience. There's folks who own maybe return partners. There's people that own the reverse logistics process and maybe the idea of sending items back to one of your vendor partners. There's no one actually owns returns. And there's no one actually owns the idea of what is the way in which we optimize returns. I haven't actually worked with a client who can actually tell me what is the impact of returns at a SKU level. So to point number 2, profitability at a SKU level. So how does the return cost for an individual SKU affect the profitability of that SKU? Or am I just allocating return costs across a category or in a department versus actually individual items actually have really different return rates than maybe the rest of the category? Perhaps a product defect, people don't like the feel of the fabric, doesn't fit quite as well, it's a new type of silhouette, people aren't used to it, variety of different things. But because certain costs are peanut buttered, it doesn't really point to the real problem. And I think when you actually really own returns, you'll start to get into the idea of these items are higher than the average return rate, and how do I work with my vendor partners to understand why? I actually have a much better idea of return data from consumers telling us why they're returning it. And I'm actually funneling that all back through the process because returns is such a huge cost now of e-commerce. Just the whole idea of the cost of the returns, how fast you can kind of take displaced inventory into sellable inventory, the entire reverse logistics process in terms of like if I actually need to send something back to a vendor, whether they give me credits for it or they challenge it and say, well, it actually avoids the warranty or avoids the whatever agreement we have, so I'm not going to give you any money. It is a really, really kind of almost like strangulation on the entire thing. And now as overall return rates are, for the most part, rising because we're making it easier, which is great for the consumer, but it really makes it extremely challenging to manage e-commerce in the long term. So another thing I'll talk about is just the overall transparency of costs. And so this kind of hits at all of them also. What is the goal, or what is the alignment of the organization when it comes to individual accounting of e-commerce costs? So once again, I need to understand profitability at a SKU level, a transaction level, a customer level. And so in the promotions that I'm doing, do I actually understand how that promotion is going to really affect long-term customer value? I might understand what the ROAS is or the incrementality is or at the transaction, but do I understand how does that actually affect the long-term value, right? Because am I driving the overconsumption of something because of a promotion, but then ultimately it ends up in a higher than average return rate, which as a marketer, as a commercial leader, I might not actually know. I might not know till a while later. I might not have ever even seen the data. I mean, I'm assuming most folks in the rooms are marketers. Has anyone ever seen return data on the impact of their promotions and what the return rates of items through one promotion are versus another promotion? As show of hands, has anyone ever seen return data? No. So return data, yes. At the promotional level, no. So understanding, did promotion A lead to a higher than average return rate? Promotion B led to an average return rate, right? So this is one of the kind of points of the paradox, which is while we are all chasing e-commerce growth, we're all competing, we're all trying to drive incrementality, we're all trying to do all of that stuff on the commercial side, the cost side, it doesn't really kind of go up. It's not pulled back up at the same level of granularity. I saw in in the predictions for this year, one of the key things was moving from brand marketing to performance marketing. And it's phenomenal. I think it's a great idea. What about performance? What about profitable marketing? What about how am I marketing and how am I driving throughput, top funnel, bottom funnel? I've heard the word funnel more times in the last 2 hours than probably the rest of my life. Where's profitability? Where is the idea of all of the things that happen after the point of sale, after the transaction? What do the different tactics that you're doing, how do they affect those? And so this is what my challenge to all of you would be with your clients, with yourselves. We need to move towards something that is actually looking at profitability. We need to look, because that's, if I flip back a couple to the, this will be the chart that will be the hardest thing to do. And it will ultimately prove what we would say is the winners and the losers over the next 5 years. Is how do you, if you're a brand or a retailer in the bottom quartiles, how do you actually use all the tactics that we talked about, maybe taking advantage of some of the advantages that we mentioned, but how do you actually move towards the top quartile? Because it's going to be really expensive over the next 5 years to compete on e-commerce. And you'll only be able to fund it and pay for it if you're actually operating in a profitable way, because of all of the investments that you'll need to make to compete. So to recap, so North Star. This is all about how are we organizing? How are we coming together across functions to be a system of leaders that looks at not just functional metrics or sales or costs or throughput or engagement rates, but actually looks at total value created, because that's what the shareholders are looking at how much value is created and how do we align on a metric together that shows that. And my example around the PFL, right? And so if the organization is a cost-centric, which is how do I deliver it to Steve at the lowest cost, you'll lose. Because a much more advanced way or a much more thorough way would be, if I'm gonna order this jacket or this suit, how many are on the shelf? Where is it at in the life cycle of how many days until I'm gonna mark it down? Where is it at? So what's the velocity? What's the cost of delivering it? There's also an interesting thing, which is if I actually know Steve a little bit better, he's actually maybe okay with me not delivering it the fastest way. He might be a category that it's actually okay not to deliver it in 2 days. So, for example, I'll go back to dresses. Dresses tend to be an occasional, a buy for an occasion. That tends to be, not always, but it tends to be a category where if it doesn't get to you in the very fast, you'll probably go buy something else because you need it for an occasion, you need it for an event, you need it for something like that. A lot of basics, socks, t-shirts, tend to be more of a replenishment category. Well, I haven't seen many clients who actually think about the idea of what is the role of the category when it comes to how am I going to think about my fulfillment logic. So maybe if I actually look through these items, I don't always need to send it to you right away because it's more of a replenishment. Maybe I shift you to a subscription model, right? All of these things are just individual tactics that are going to have to be deployed to really fight this kind of e-commerce cost that is rising faster than the growth. And there's just all these individual tactics. And so I think that kind of goes into the aligning around the North Star. What are the ways at which we're going to organize ourselves across functions to align on the metrics that will drive long-term profitability? So second thing, just to recap. So generating more value from fixed assets. So it's all about item, transaction, customer level profitability. So it covers everything. Because It is only a good transaction if it's profitable. It's only a good promotion if it's profitable, or it's profitable long-term. The individual promotion this time may be unprofitable, but if it's building loyalty, and I can show that because it's actually building engagement, it's building me to be more engaged, more loyal to an individual brand or retailer, that's great. But where is the analysis around how that affects long-term loyalty or long-term value? Right? This is all, so individual item profitability. This is all about ways at which you can get the accounting right? You can get, how do I actually understand individual costs? So most things for e-commerce are more expensive than they are for brick and mortar. Marketing tends to be a little less effective. Credit card fees are more expensive. Obviously, logistics is more expensive than labor in the stores. All of those things are, but how do you actually account for them in an activity-based way, so that at a transaction level, right? I know a transaction or a SKU level or customer level, I know the profit of that, right? So we talked about returns rates. All of those things, all the different costs, or all the different things that add up in an e-commerce transaction or a series of e-commerce transactions. How do I start to kind of break those down, understand how much of that should be in each individual transaction or customer or SKU, and actually get the accounting right? Because what you'll find is you will start to make really different decisions. You'll make really different decisions around what vendors you want to partner with, which items you want to promote. One of the things I found quite interesting is when it comes to generating more value from fixed assets, the idea of the product pool page, right? Most product pool pages are the order of the products in the pool tends to be either how popular they are or how new they are, but there's almost never in the algorithm around what to list first is the idea of which item is more profitable. Like, because the order at which you list things will over time drive the likelihood of buying. And so, yeah, of course I want you to see the newest stuff, or I want you to see the most popular stuff, but how can I use the invisible hand to help push customers towards items that are just frankly more profitable? They're just all of these small, and it might not work everywhere, it might not work for every category, and it's not saying let's just rank order based on what's most profitable for us, but just think about it as part of the algorithm. Think about it as part of the ways at which I am trying to kind of shift customers to more profitable transactions without them even knowing it. And I can think that kind of starts to hit on number 3, is there are a lot of tactics with customers that are both lower cost, and you're putting more control in the eyes of the customer. Like, one of the most famous examples is the idea of a self-service checkout, right? As I'm bagging my own groceries, right? I feel generally good about it, right? Self-service kiosks for checking in for a flight, generally the engagement scores are higher than working with an agent. But how can you take that same mindset versus giving either the consumer something makes it easier, or you incentivize them, right? So, hey, here's a small percentage off for using a debit card. Here's a small percentage off for buying it online, picking it up in store. Or if you do it, then we give you some more points. Or how do you start to get that in the eyes of the consumers, that you start to build these habits? Maybe you take away the promotions or the loyalty dollars over time, but you change the habit. I found it quite interesting that a lot of apps tend to give you, right, promotion to start using either, if you guys are familiar with the idea of an ACH wallet or something like that, which is like connecting your credit card to an individual app, or connecting your credit card to your bank account to an app. Usually a promotion to start doing it, and they take the promotion away after that. Well, now you're hooked on. Now your credit card or your bank account is fed into the app. And so now they have a much less expensive way to engage you. And so this is something that is just not used enough. And this brings to the last point, which is it's not used enough because it's too slow to get organized around these individual use cases. I mean, I've probably gone through 20, 25 different individual use cases that they're all one small piece of the puzzle, but they all have to be done. There's not really a if or a maybe. They all need to be done. They all need to be done, but they need to be individualized for the organization, individualized for the consumer, because all of the themes of these tactics are really what will be the solutions that help shift from kind of bottom quartile, bottom 2 quartiles to top quartile, or even top quartile to making a whole new quartile. Because it is a war of attrition. I mean, everybody can use the same tactics, but it's gonna really be who can organize themselves faster, who can test and learn more effectively. I think this really comes into another thing that I saw, the idea of incrementality is dead and something around first-party data and the whole idea of much more rapid testing. I mean, you all are the masters of testing. You're all the masters of what actually tactics should we use? Is it effective? How to change the tactic tomorrow? The rest of the organization doesn't have that kind of muscle to be so fast, how do I try something to see if the consumer reacts to it? If it doesn't work, how do I try something different? How do I really get in this idea of agility and speed and the idea of individual use cases and individual ways in which to organize cross-functionally, right? I talked about the idea of who owns returns, who owns all of these cross-functional processes that cut across commercial, supply chain, finance, organizing in agile pods or scrum teams or whatever you want to call them to solve these use cases and then to do them. And then if it doesn't work, then change them. And if you need to adapt them, then do it again. But when we work in these large organizations and we work with our teams and our largely functional teams, and we're shooting towards our metrics and we're shooting towards our objectives, we without even knowing it, we tend to be kind of driving our consumer to less profitable transactions, less profitable SKUs, less profitable lifecycle value. And I would say, in general, most of the folks that have risen to the top quartile, as of right now, tend to have a lot of those advantages that we talked about, right? The advantages of they tend to be in categories that have lower return rates. They tend to have a bigger share of own brand items versus national brand items. They tend to be in categories that are just easier because they're higher value, higher basket value, or higher just price point. But pretty soon, those advantages are going to start to erode because of the companies that are going to really do a lot of what I just talked about. And they will start to rise up, and they will start to rise and really create new challenger positions. So to close, I think this is really a time for all of us, right, with our clients, to help them think about e-commerce profitability, not just about e-commerce growth. Because that's really what we kind of found in the research, and that's what we've been working a lot with our clients around, because the idea of e-commerce growth at all costs, or with a more of a kind of focus, it really has to be balanced with the idea of profitability. All right, thanks everyone.